Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Caitlin. I am the events and social media coordinator for Madison Street Books. We're so excited to be partnering with a public space to put on this short story panel and readings from some incredible writers this evening. So just really quickly, Madison Street Books is located in the West Loop in Chicago. We opened 2 days before the pandemic last March, and then immediately shut our doors. And we are so thankful to still be here and to be able to be doing events and collaborating with presses like a public space. So this evening, I think we've got an incredible event for you guys. Feel free to interact in the chat if you have any questions. There is an Ask a Question button down at the bottom of the screen. You can use that, and we'll have a little Q&A portion at the end of the evening. So I have with me here on screen Megan Cummins. Megan's first book, If the Body Allows It, was longlisted for the Story Prize and the Bingham Prize for debut story collection. She is the managing editor of a public space, and she lives in Brooklyn. So welcome, Megan.
Oh, thank you so much, Caitlin, for having me and for having these all of these incredible story writers here tonight. So I'm going to introduce our first reader, Sara Majka, and I think Caitlin will invite her up onto the screen so she'll be able to read for us. So Sara Majka is the author of the story collection Cities I've Never Lived In, published by Graywolf Press and the Public Space Books. She lives in Providence, where she teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Sara.
All right, thank you. Hi, Megan, thank you. Well, I've been thinking a lot of the short story since being invited to do this. Thank you, Madison Street Books and a public space and my fellow readers and everybody attending tonight. I'm going to read work in progress, so it feels a little sensitive to be reading it. My first book I put out was a collection of stories that were linked stories. And this, I guess I'm kind of halfway through what's probably the second collection. And these are also linked, but they're even more linked. So a part of me is thinking a lot about stories. What makes a story? Is this a story collection or is this a novel? But I'm going to be reading actually 2 stories, but they're super short. I kind of picked them for that reason, so I could get all the way through both of them. One's 2 pages, one's 1 page. Since they're linked, there's actually a few things you have to know. She has a boyfriend named Tom. She's having some relationship problems. She's gotten passionately interested in stocks. This is going to be all about stocks, really weird stocks though. And she writes about stocks on a forum. Okay, first one's called Algae. Thus begun during these months a period of wonder. Had I been able, I would have told Tom it was that's her boyfriend, Tom. It was one of those things that at first seems meaningless and short-lived. And then you're into it, but you'll think you'll stop soon. And then the understanding that you're not going to stop. And then what comes after? It's like free falling, like being alive and making mistakes that you're trying to minimize as you're making them. Like the time I went to a hotel with the guy from the solar panel company. The rush wasn't the danger or risk. It was simply an inexplicability in feeling both alive and puzzled by yourself at the same time. Tom lived that way too and should have understood. Sometimes I think love is like 2 travelers who decided they can't travel and be together at the same time. So they just put down their suitcases, but then neither of them are themselves anymore. I used to love holding suitcases when I was a bit younger. My suitcase bought at a yard sale was too heavy. When I flew to Paris on Iceland, not on Iceland Air, but something else, maybe Iceland Express. Well, they almost killed us, and they also lost my stuff, but also I had to pay extra because of the weight of the bag. But the friend I was visiting in a tiny village in the south of France, he found his grandmother's old dresses in the stone wine cellar. It was one of those villages where all the buildings are next to each other, sharing walls. Those striped 40s French dresses, they were neither glamorous nor well-fitting, but I was happy, and I gave it up, not because I became a mother or because I fell in love with Tom, but because every moment is always being given up. And who can fault time for giving away moments like those and giving us new and increasingly desperate moments? Seaweed, I would have told Tom, had he asked. They're wanting to make plastic out of seaweed, and they grow algae in glass tubes. They want to feed the algae to salmon in salmon farms. All that pink fish, can't you see it eating the algae? And they say they're going to make windows out of wood. They can do that now, not the frame, the glass, I don't know. You read all these things and you can see the wonders of the future, and you want to put your money behind it so that the future isn't colorless and filthy with Dow chemicals, China Petroleum, BASF. But let us return to the algae, because that's what I was thinking of back then, the algae growing in tubes. It was microalgae. I imagine it like the luscious green carpet that left traces on your feet. At first, they grew it in ponds, but it was hard to control the sunlight that way. Even in the desert, they'd rather grow it under LED light, but there was difficulty with that too, because there's a certain distance into the algae that light can't penetrate. And algae needs all the light it can get, so they had to make the tubes thin. Red light would have been the best for photosynthesis, but red light doesn't penetrate as well. And I was glad, because it would have been garish looking, like a Christmas display, and no one was going to buy a stock if it was garish. We wanted the real deal, the green tubes, the clear light, all of it like we were going to outer space. It was so pristine. I don't know. But there was a worry that despite the great promise of algae, customers remained hesitant, uncertain. I guess algae had held great promise for a long time, decade. Was it algae's time, I wondered. I thought those things during the day, and there was no one to tell it to, so I started to creepingly ask it on the forum. Might it be algae's time? The plastic bags have had their time, the chemicals have had their time, the bottles, the effluent, the landfills. We haven't, as a society, really tried algae yet. It was fantastical. No one saw the wonders I saw just sitting at the kitchen table looking at my computer. But I haven't mentioned what algae does. In here, it's a bit uncertain. There were a variety of directions, and no one was quite sure. Algae started as a way to clean the air. If you have the factory outputs go through the algae, it eats the pollution and the air is clean. But factories aren't going to pay money for algae when the sky takes all the pollution for free, so no money in cleaning air. But the actual algae has uses too. The salmon farms need better food than what they've been eating. There's uses for human consumption, but the salmon would be a major scale up. But what they were increasingly hoping for, and what I thought the stock was rising, but why I was also suspicious they were selling empty hopes, is that they were pushing algae use in pharmaceuticals. They couldn't sell their product for what it was meant for, and so I worried. But when the stock went up, I thought maybe they were telling the truth, and only a small group could see it. But soon, a much larger group would see it as well. And the second story, it's one paragraph, Pond Technologies. I had been prepared to buy the stock and lose slowly the small amount my heart had allotted for that microalgae, possessing in my way those tubes, the clear skies, the tiny fish eating, and to slowly watch the money go in a joke so complicated that no one would understand it. The fish, can you imagine? But there was some difficulty when I went to convert the money. It hadn't cleared, and it took days, and meanwhile the stock rose. It rose again and again each day while I waited. I couldn't even look at the number when I opened the computer. The joke had grown deeper, wider, richer, and it felt intolerable to be alone with it. I tried to write to the forum. Guys, I fell in love with the microalgae stock in Canada, was unable to buy. It seems the factory was never built. I see green everywhere. Do you ever feel this way? Thinking these things, I went to wash the broccoli, and there was a ladybug on my coffee cup circling the rim. I saw a typo. That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was so beautiful. You can feel free to, you can minimize your video if you want to not stay on camera, but you're welcome to. That couplet of stories was so mesmerizing. So our next reader is Ada Zhang, and I think Caitlin will bring her up. Ada is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her debut collection, The Sorrows of Others, is forthcoming from a public space book in spring 2023. Thank you so much for joining us, Ada. I'm so excited to get a sneak peek of your collection coming out in just under 2 years.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is my first reading ever, so I'm super excited that it's with Madison Street Books and a public space. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of the story Compromise, which is in the latest issue of Public Space. Lots of great writers in here. I'm just going to start from the beginning. My name is Sway, and in June I'll be turning 60. I have 3 adult children. Their names are Charlotte, Pam, and David. My husband died in October while the leaves were still green and clinging to their branches. Now it is spring and there are new leaves, and I am a widow. Such are the major facts of my life. I live alone in the house my husband left me. I work as the secretary at Royal Dental on Lamar Boulevard, a job I've had for about as long as I've been in the US, long enough to watch the practice pass from Dr. Baker, the original proprietor, to his son. I take in the mail and water my plants. On weekends, I prepare a meal whenever I get hungry, which is sometimes twice and sometimes 4 times a day, indulging a little in the absence of structure. I talk to my children on the phone whenever one of them thinks to call. I say hello to my neighbors, who are comforting to me in the same way that my house is, as guideposts in time, reminding me of who I am. I've known most of them for over 20 years. They're the closest I have to friends. When I wave to them from across our yards, I think how lucky I am to be standing at a distance, oblivious to the details of their lives, how they move inside their homes, and to not have to see their faces up close. A person's face is like a house, I think. The marks and stains and sunken places are proof of what has happened, but they cannot tell the whole story. Even before my husband died, I was treated like a widow. That was 18 years ago when he left. I was not young, but I was younger. My neighbors are Christians. Most of them go to Hill County Bible just a couple miles down the road next to the Korean grocery store where I like to buy fruit. They brought casseroles and brownies to my doorstep, sending their small children sometimes for extra sweetness, and I was not charmed or annoyed by this so much as I was amused. When Mrs. Wilhite, the very old preacher's very old wife, had asked me on the sidewalk one evening how my husband was, only a week after Huayu told me he was staying in Beijing, he wasn't coming back, I told her the truth because I saw no reason not to. He's gone, I'd said. Her blue eyes bulged out of her powdered white face. Another woman, I explained. In China, I added, to calm any questions about who she might be. Affair, I said slowly. It was an English word I'd practiced for the sole purpose of explaining my situation. Back then, David was only 5 and running around in his underwear, aiming dart guns at his older sisters. Now he's a year out of college. I don't know much about the Christian faith, but I do know something about people, and I think they treated me like a widow in order to preserve my dignity, because out of the myriad ways to experience loss, death is by far the noblest. A month after I told Mrs. Wilhite the news, she showed up at my doorstep holding an envelope. By this point, the gifts and pasta salads and people just checking up on me had subsided somewhat. For you, she'd said, from the congregation. Inside were 10 $100 bills. Just something to tide you over. I took the money. Why not? As the Americans say, I had 3 mouths to feed. I traced the lines in Mrs. Wilhite's face, moving from her eyes down to her pink neck. Then she said, Xiwang, and it was like when I'd said affair. It sounded tentative. Xiwang, hope. Xiwang, she said again, just before turning to leave. Mrs. Wilhite has since passed away, and so has her husband, the preacher. They weren't alive to witness my husband's return, his rebirth, one might say, this past fall. He had pancreatic cancer. My sister-in-law called me from Beijing in July, just after I turned 59, and I had to ask her to repeat her name. It had been so long since I'd heard from her. She claimed that hospice care was better in the US than in China, and I didn't ask about the other woman, the one he'd left us for all those years ago. Instead, I asked how much time. The doctors say half a year, she said, her words choppy over the phone. Later, when I told my kids, they warned me that it could end up being much longer than that. They said these things are unpredictable and you never know when someone might live longer than expected, although in my husband's case, it ended up being shorter. When I didn't respond, my sister-in-law said, he's still his children's father. She whispered it like it was a secret, like I didn't know. They should see him before he goes, right? I didn't tell her that my children hated their father and that to them hate was as much a virtue as love. They called the idea absurd and unfair, and for the 3 months that Huayu lived here in his old home, Pam was the only one who visited. The others don't know I'm here, she said after I swung open the front door. I thought it was going to be the nurse, Toby. She stepped around me to get inside. When had she arrived in town, I wondered, and how long was she planning on staying? What made her decide to come? I stayed standing with the door wide open, blinking at the street. It was September and the weather was sunny and mild with a delicious breeze. My neighbor saw me and waved. I waved back. Is that him? I closed the door. She gestured with her head at the bed in the living room, which sat facing the windows to the backyard. The blinds were drawn. It was afternoon and dark in the house. Who else could it be? Huayu was asleep. I realized that I was more nervous for Pam than I'd been for myself. When I saw Huayu in the airport for the first time in almost 2 decades, it was as I had predicted. Shocking, not because he was someone I once knew, but because he was a person I did not recognize. The sickness had altered him. It was like receiving a new man, a new husband, and to me this was a relief. I'd agreed to do this because I know that death is the greatest simplifier. It covers up old wounds, which is basically as good as healing them. At the airport, a woman in a vest was pushing Huayu in a wheelchair. I spotted him not by searching for my husband, but by searching for anybody who looked sick. Then he pointed at me, and it made me wonder what he'd been looking for, what gave me away. He was amazingly thin. His hair was white and sparsely laid. His coat was a gray shell, and he curled himself deep into it, the flesh around his mouth and eyes like wax that had dripped and hardened again. I followed Pam to Huayu's bedside. The living room had remained unchanged, aside from the bed and the PCA machine, which was connected to the IV in Huayu's hand. I tried to recall the last time Pam was here. My kids have stopped coming home for the holidays. They prefer going to Charlotte's in California, and I can't complain because they always buy my plane ticket. It was only some years ago, I remembered, when David graduated from high school. There was still the brown leather couch and the matching one-seater, the same glass coffee table. Pam looked down at her father's sleeping face, the jowly skin. How dare you come back to us, she said, like she was reciting a fact. I watched them from behind the headboard. Huayu's mouth was open. His breaths were strained as though the air were passing through a grated barrier. How dare you come back to us like this? She stayed looking at her father until the hum of the machine grew loud, the chirping of his vitals sucking up the quiet in the house like insects in the night. He won't wake for a while, I said, to break the noise. Of course, now I wish I'd said something else, something that would have validated what Pam was feeling, even though she didn't understand that her father could only come back like this, only with death as the circumstance. The morphine puts him into a very deep sleep. It turned out that Pam was only staying for one night, and even so, she booked a hotel. I changed my mind. I don't want to be here when he's out, she said, once we were back outside. In the sunlight, her hair took on a matted sheen. I noticed that her face looked sharper, like someone had pinched her jaw toward the tip of her chin. She'd lost weight, or maybe she was just getting older. I mostly just wanted to check on you anyway. I fly back in the morning. You're sure you don't want to talk to him? I said. I thought that she should, if only to save herself from regret in the future. Don't tell Charlotte and David I came. I'll tell them myself later. I won't, I said. Don't tell him I came either. At this, I felt myself frown, but I promised. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ada. I was following along in issue 29 of A Public Space, in which compromise appears. It was wonderful to hear it with your voice reading it to us. So we have one more reader tonight, and I just want to say too, please feel free to put questions in the Ask a Question box. We would love to know what you're thinking about the work that's being read, or about writing short stories and editing short stories in general. So please don't be shy. So I think we can bring up Arinze Ifakandu, our next reader. Arinze is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he won the 2018 Richard Yates Short Story Contest. He was shortlisted for the Kane Prize in 2017 and was a 2015 A Public Space Emerging Writer Fellow for his story, God's Children Are Little Broken Things. His stories have recently appeared in A Public Space, One Story, and Guernica. His debut collection of stories, God's Children Are Little Broken Things, is forthcoming from A Public Space Books in 2022. Thank you so much for joining us, Arinze. I think we're going to bring him up in just a second.
He should be coming up any second, Megan.
He's on his way, guys. It's we have to get the crowdcast sorted. Yes, please do put your questions. Don't be shy. Ask your questions.
It says he's connecting, Megan. It should just be 1 second.
We're
He may be
connecting.
having a little.
It's, still, even after more than a year of the pandemic, still the online, the crowdcast, the Zooms, you never know. So if you, you're welcome to submit. Read my story. I was just going to say, I want to know in the chat who among you are working on short story collections. Where are you with the process? Ask a question. So it looks like we have a little invitation problem with Crowdcast, but we're working to resolve it. But yeah, I imagine there have to be short story writers in the bunch. So where are you in the process? Do you have thoughts on putting together? Anoop is, you are, that's fabulous. I can, oh, yay, oh, Arinze, yay. Yay, welcome. I was afraid I would have to, actually you can see my stack of books on my bookshelf right there. I was gonna reach over, no, I'm kidding. Thank you so much. Everyone, this is Arinze. I read his bio, but I'm so glad he's here to read from one of the stories from his forthcoming collection. So I'll let you take it away, Arinze.
Thank you, Megan. The devil is a liar. Anyway, I'm going to read from God's Children and Little Broken Things, which we are currently editing, and I'm going to read like the edited version. It's divided in sections, and I'm going to like signify the sections by taking like short pauses. And for those of you who, I don't know, who have already read the story, like there's like a section that was at the end originally, but then it's, had to move it to the beginning, and I hope that goes well. Okay, so here it is. You met in your second year. He reminded you of Dave. At the stadium that cloudy evening, when you played against his department, you walked up to him at halftime and said, I wanted to tell you that you reminded me of someone, with what you knew was a weak smile, and then you were gone. On your way home, you called Rachel and told her you loved her so much. Did she know that? And you told yourself again that Dave had almost put you in trouble. Jesus. You met him again at Christ Church Chapel, where he played the organ so well on Mothering Sunday, the entire church was filled with a tender light. The women burst into tongues in the middle of hymns, and the chaplain for once didn't say, first and last verses only. You couldn't believe it, that his legs could strike the pedal so strongly. He looked so small behind the organ. Occasionally, he threw his head back and closed his eyes, the sun on his face making his lips redder, his skin a lighter brown. After the service, you lingered around the door of the choir room until he came out and said, "Hey." "Hey," you said, scratching your head and glancing at the floor. "I did not know you worshipped here." "I usually play the second service," he said. "Wish I could play for 6:30 though. Get the day started and done early." "It's parked here for 6:30, you told him. "You'd be a star." He chuckled. He spoke in a rush. You would learn later of his slight stutter, yet softly, and looked you directly with eyes that were white and clear. You found yourself standing there a second long after you had exchanged numbers. You whistled on your way home, skipped by the roadside like a little boy, giddy. He called you twice, first to know how your day had been. You said, "Fine." The second time he called, he told you that his piano instructor was OCD. The man didn't give him any breathing space. You were surprised and pleased by his openness, and thought of something wise to say. You said, "Really?" After that, he stopped calling, and you did not call either. Not until the night Dumebi texted you that Mom and Dad were quarreling. Could you please call them now? You were asleep when the text message came in, and when you woke up at midnight, you had 11 missed calls. You tried to call her back, but she wasn't answering. You started to dial Mom's number, but then stopped. Then you dialed his number. His voice was rough. "Hey, Lutanna." You sat up in bed, running your fingers through your hair. "Hey, Kamsi," you said. "Didn't expect you to be awake." "I'm rehearsing my exam pieces," he said. "I see." Then you told him everything. How every time Mom and Dad would quarrel, even though it was in low tones, the entire house seemed to reverberate with their bitterness. How it hurt you in the chest so badly you couldn't breathe. Shit, you couldn't breathe. Then, because he was so quiet, you said, "I'm not even sure why I'm telling you this. I hope I didn't disturb you." No, he said. "Not at all." "Okay." And then you asked how he was doing and what were the pieces he was playing. The next day was Saturday. The girls from his department had a football match with the girls from his. The match was already on when you came, and you walked straight to him after shaking hands with your friends. He folded his arms across his chest, smiled so widely it made you happy simply standing there, saying, "How have you been, bro?" You sat with him on the racing track. He was wearing three-quarter shorts and an Arsenal jersey, the hair on his legs and arms black and curly against the light brown of his skin. "You have nice legs," he said. "Let's run." He said no, weakly, but you pulled him up, called him lazy, and laughed at his pout. He did not run 100 meters before he stopped. He bent over, his hands on his knees. You walked to him, laughing. "Mozart, you dey four hands, oh," his classmate said, laughing as well. He was panting. He collapsed on the track and lay on his back. "Lazy," you said, smiling down at him. "Is this how you do your girlfriend?" He arched an eyebrow, stared at you. You did not hold his gaze, merely chuckled, and then you sat on the ground beside where he lay. You are in Nsukka. Everything looks worn, fading. You walk to the stadium, still incomplete after all these years, and sit on the step on what should be the spectator stand. It is getting late, and the bodybuilders are packing and leaving. A flock of herons have descended on the football field, where the Hamatan haze covers everything. You met in this same stadium, where you sit now, watching the herons and the late evening joggers. You used to return here often, both of you, and he used to tease you about checking out the bodybuilders, which made you laugh. You muster the will and finally called him maybe. You say, "You remember my friend Kamsi? I told you about him." "Yes," she says. You breathe in, deep. On the tracks, an old man is jogging slowly. He has gone several laps at the same speed, shoulders hunched, fists balled together. It is the sort of thing you would call to tell Kamsi. He would have found it cute and hopeful. "Are you sure? Sorry, are you there?" Dumebi says. Then, "Is everything okay?" "He was my boyfriend," you say. A sob rises in your chest. Dumebi is quiet. The old man pauses with his hands akimbo, then starts again. Oh, Lota, Dumebi says finally, her voice warm with pity. You start to cry. She stays on the phone with you. You told him Rachel was the best thing that ever happened to you. Told him she saved you. From what? He asked. You won't understand, you said. You were seated on a step at the stadium, watching the sun, once yellow, watching the sun, once white, fade into a calm yellow, his hands tapping rhythms on his knees as he tried to get the words out of his mouth. Don't conclude so quickly, he said, but I understand if you don't want to tell me. You put your hands in your pockets, stood up. It's getting late, you said. We should start going. You had noticed certain things about him, little things. How his stutter became obvious only when it was cold or when he was being emotional. How when he told you about his past hookups, he looked you bold in the eyes, teasing, does my story make you honey? How the shyness billowed in his voice, even though he tried to sound flippant and cool. How he liked to sing whenever he was in the bathroom. You often heard him screaming, Ekuro la la bakuewa. And it made you laugh because he sounded so much like Justin Bieber screaming, baby, 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 oh. Nobody sang Davido with that kind of voice. All right, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Orinze. That was so wonderful to hear you read from the revision that you just sent in. So it's hot off the press. So I think Caitlin is going to bring Ada and Sara back in for a Q&A, but since I have you here, I thought I would start with a question for you, specifically about this story. So I love the second person in this story, and I was thinking earlier about second person and short stories, and I know that there are novels written in second person, but for some reason second person to me feels like its territory is the short story. And so I was wondering how you were thinking about this story in general, but also with the second person, but also in general, the choice of second person for stories. What made you choose second person for this?
I mean, the choice wasn't really like an intentional choice, but for me, it was more of like an emotional one. So like when I began writing the story, I tried the first person, it didn't sound quite right. And then I tried second person, and there was something just like immediately intimate about it. And this is like a character who has been through something, and he's in the aftermath of this experience. And hopefully this experience has allowed him sort of see the world differently, has allowed him grow in certain ways. And it feels like, to me, like a letter to his own self, to a younger version of himself or something, and there's something about the second person that's, at least the way I see it working in the story, that allows, that feeling of looking back, at one's own experience, sort of resonates.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this gorgeous sort of devastating distance in this story. And I feel that with the second person too, in general. So I think we're having a bit of a tech trouble. We're trying to get Sara back. So Caitlin is working on it. I apologize, but good thing I have a question prepared just for you, Ada, as well. So I wanted to, I was so glad you read from your piece, and also from that beautiful section. And as you were reading, I was thinking of that line near the end of the section you read, where where Sue wants to save her daughter from regret later. I'm sorry, Sue wants to save her daughter from regret later on. And it just sort of made me think that the children in the story think of decisions differently than the adults. At least to me, it sort of seems that way. The children sort of think of decisions as final, but then, with the adults, even with the father who leaves for another woman, he ends up coming back. Like, that seems like it's a final decision, his leaving, but then he's back. Is that something you were thinking about at all, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that believing that decisions are final is a straightforward way to live life, and it can make moving forward, moving on a lot easier if you can just accept just say this is what this was, but Sway is not like that. She's not like her kids. So her husband wants to come back, and she lets him come back as a sick man, and takes care of him. And yeah, I think it's something that I like to write about or think about, characters and people who cannot get over things, events that have happened to them, or people that have come into their life and left. But I think it's much more mentally healthy to not be like that, to just move forward. If someone has hurt you, you can just say, well, then that person is not ever going to come into my life again. But for Sway, that's just not her. That's not her worldview. So it does create this distance between her and her children.
I love that beautiful thought Sway has when she just observes. It's almost sort of like she's a little baffled by it, that her children seem to think that hate is as sort of respectable as love. The fact that they could come to that decision. Okay, so we're having trouble getting Sara up here. So one option, if you can't make me the host to eliminate one person, we can bring Sara up now. I think we're gonna have to just toggle back and forth a little bit. I'm sorry, everyone. But we are managing, with the tech troubles as best we can. And so I think we have Sara coming up in just a second. You can turn your video on, Sara. Excellent. Hi, Sara. Sorry about this, but thank you to Sara and everyone for bearing with us. So Sara, I'm still sort of like floating with like sort of a landscape of green algae and sunlight. I love that line you had about, you want that the narrative wants it to be so pristine that it could go into outer space. That was just so beautiful. And I love Sara's collection. If you don't know it, is Cities I've Never Lived In. It's such a gorgeous collection. It's one of my favorites. It had a huge influence on my book. And it's a linked collection. And so you mentioned, Sara, that you've been thinking a lot about what's a story, what's a linked collection, what's something bigger. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, maybe with your collection, but also with what you're working on now, which it seems to me might also be linked. So I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit about that.
Right. I think a lot about this. Because my first collection, I think the first half of it, they're pretty separate stories. A lot of them are third person. But I think the second half are really linked with the first person, like the similar narrator. And I think I've kind of picked that up with the second one. And, I used to try to write a novel because I grew up reading novels and I love them. So I, wanted to write one. And every time I tried, I just wrote really poorly. I would feel really let in. I'd be overwhelmed with all the structure you have to make, and it never came to life. But when I try to write a short story, and it just has to be, it just has to be, it doesn't have to be anything else, but it feels really freeing to me. And so I love the short story for that, and probably feel that I could only write that way. And, I've grown to love it, reading it, and others as well, almost more so. But where was I going with this? But I like to work with something for a long time. You know, I get a lot of new ideas. I keep thinking about the same thing for years. And so I think that the link in that way is helpful to me. And I think right now, probably what I have is something maybe a little bit in the middle. So I'm not sure what exactly it is.
That's sort of what I love about, the short story form, though, is it can be a little bit amorphous sometimes, where it challenges its own form in a way. And novels can do that too, but something about something so long, it just feels like after a certain point, to me, it just becomes a novel. But I love the possibilities with stories, with form, and with how you organize. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to ask a question for all three of our readers. And so maybe Caitlin, after, and maybe we'll start with Ada, and maybe you can bring Arinze up after Ada finishes her answer, and we can get Arinze in here. So when we're thinking about structure, when we're thinking about form, I have been thinking a lot about sort of what's the difference between a short story collection and a pile of stories. It's or like when you are writing stories, at what point do they become a book? And I know that can be different for different writers, but I was curious for all of you, all of our story writers here, as you were writing your stories, like, when did you know you had a book? Was it when you wrote one story that you felt, or like, okay, this one brings all these together? Or did you know from the beginning? Were you writing toward some idea of what stories you wanted to be in that book? Or was it just one particular piece that made you realize, or maybe, maybe there's nothing wrong with a pile of stories. I did not mean to sound judgmental against a pile of stories, but Ada, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. I don't think, gosh, I certainly didn't feel like at any point when I was drafting any one of the stories that I was writing a collection. I think anytime I would have to think about the stories as being attached in that way to other stories, it would make me feel very nervous and just I could only handle, short stories are so mysterious, and I think I'm only now learning the form of the short story collection. So for a while I was just so focused on just the story, like any one story. But I will say now that I am thinking about it as a collection, which I think didn't happen until a public space graciously acquired the pile of stories, that I do now feel that it is a collection, and I've started to use that word, collection, which I never used before. I would say my stories. And I think it's because I just feel that this, I started the first story, oh gosh, it will have been eight years between the first and publication. So I feel like I've charted this part of my heart, this emotional territory. I feel kind of good letting it go. Like, I feel like I can think and write about other things. So I think that it feels very much, that has told me that this was a collection.
Oh, that's such a good way. I love thinking about it that way, that you've charted that territory and you feel like you're moving on. And that's the book you were working on. That's so great. Sara, what about you? What was there a moment or a story that sort of brought your collection together?
My cities I've never lived in. I just think I wicked wanted to publish a book, I had this like 200-page obsession. Like, as long as I could get up to 200 pages, I didn't care, but I piled in. But so they were individual stories at first, but I do think by the end it did feel more whole to me, like a collection. And the one I'm working on now feels like it's one piece, like I'm working on it all together. I let Bridget, editor at Public Space, read like half of it. She had a good word. She called it a sequence. And I like that, like to think of it as a sequence. It doesn't, what is it? A sequence. I kind of like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like thinking of it as a sequence, especially when it's linked. It sort of just implies this togetherness. Orenze, what about you? Were you thinking of this book as a book the whole time, or was there a story that made it that way?
Yeah, I was thinking of it as a collection from the very beginning. So I had this very wonderful idea that to write a novel, I had to learn how to I had to learn by writing a collection of short stories. In the middle of like writing the collection, I realized that was a foolish idea, because a collection of short stories is work in its own, and it is not inferior to a novel. It is not. It is as hard. I hope. I think. I haven't tried a novel yet, but I found it was also hard work. But the process of it also taught me very different things. But yeah, to answer the question, I started at the beginning out. I said I was going to write a collection, and they were going to be tied. The collection was going to be tied by theme, right? The theme of love and family and things like that, but centering queer men. So yeah, I was thinking that this was going to be a book of collection from the very beginning. And Ada said earlier that she had thought of her book as a collection, it would have been scary. It was quite scary when I got to the middle of the collection, because then I was writing and I was sent to some of my friends, and at some point they were like, "Oh, I think you've done this before, and you've done this other thing before," and there's like the pressure to sort of make things varied, which I feel perhaps I wouldn't have felt that pressure if I wasn't thinking of the book as a collection. If I was just like writing stories singly, but now that pressure is gone after a while, because I realized that the stories are varied in their own ways, even if a lot of the stories are about love and family, but there are different characters, and these characters have different experiences, and in that way each story is unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with your stories, each story sort of uncovers a new layer of the themes and ideas you're working with, or shows it from a different angle. And I can't wait for this book to be out in the world. So we have a couple questions, and I think we definitely want all three panelists up, or all three readers up on the screen for the questions. So I think what we're going to do is our gracious host, Caitlin, is going to moderate the audience Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get your guys' questions in. So I think Caitlin's going to kick me off, and she's going to take over the Q&A and bring Ada back, because we definitely need all three of our readers up here to answer your guys' questions. So thank you guys so much for having me. It was so wonderful to get to hear you read. And thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Megan. Bye. Oh, no. Oh, here.
Okay. So Ada should be joining us. Yes, perfect. I apologize again for the technical issues. Had no idea that Crowdcast was going to play games today. We have a few questions in the chat for you guys after all of your beautiful stories. The first one is for Ada. It says, Ada, what surprised you while writing Compromise?
Oh, well, what surprised me was actually, it's funny because Orenze was in this workshop with me, but we were with our wonderful teacher, Charles D'Ambrosio, and the first draft of this story was written in the third person. And it was okay. I actually reread it kind of recently, and it whatever. But but he was like, you got to get closer. There's a body. He's dying. Why isn't she looking at it? And so I was like, oh my gosh, do I have to? I had never done a revision where I had to totally change the point of view, and it felt like a big task. So, but then I did it. I tried, because it was, the first person. You can often get a little closer. And it was sort of, it was one of those writing experiences where it's so nice. I remember I think it was like during Thanksgiving, and so it was in Iowa City. It was very cold. Everyone had gone home for the holidays, and I just entered kind of this fugue state where I rewrote the whole story in a different point of view, and it really did allow me to get closer to the main character, to get closer so she allow her to see things, see her children, see her husband, see the dying person in front of her. So that's just, that surprised me that I had to, do that. And I learned something from it. Don't be afraid of those very radical changes that sometimes have to happen.
Arenze, there's a question in the chat for you. Arenze, excuse me. It says, your stories always have beautifully rendered spaces. And I wanted to ask if in your process you move from setting to narrative, or does the narrative come to you first and then the setting emerges?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So like, a writer I admire so much uses the word affect a lot, and I feel like that sort of like resonates with me. When I'm writing, I'm trying to create a feeling. I'm trying to create a mood. Like I'm trying to bring out an atmosphere. And I feel, for me, place is very important. Like in sort of creating mood, how deeply a place is realized, as well as character, how deeply a character is realized. So, and I also love, I love beautiful sentences. I love like sentences that are kind of showy. And so for me, it's like I do both at the same time. So when I'm writing, I want as much as possible to, to know the world that my character inhabits. And for me, and I also want to love what I'm writing. Like when I write and I go back the next day and I read it, I want it to have like a rhythm. I want it to have, a certain kind of flow. And yeah, to answer the question, it's both things are equally important to me. And while writing, I there are writers who say, another writer I admire, gave this wonderful advice, where she said she advised us to sort of like write the whole thing, write the nonsense, and then go back and, and when editing, then we can then slow down. I try that, but it doesn't work for me. I just cannot enjoy the process if the sentences are not sounding like the way I envision them to sound, even if it's like during the first draft. So yeah, both the narrative and just like the space, the setting, are equally important to me at the moment of creation.
Arenze, I read your God's Children Broken Things just recently when I was helping Christina create the quiz, and lots of beautiful sentences in there for sure.
Thank you.
There's a question in here for Sara, and it says, have you noticed anything different, any change or new development between the first collection and the book you're currently working on?
Yeah, probably in the sense of what I was talking about, where it seems kind of a little more in the middle, a little less solid stories, and a little more, I don't know. It's strange. It's strange to write during the pandemic. I was thinking of both your answers, Arenze and Ada. That's interesting advice. about getting closer. Like, there's a body in the room. Why isn't she looking at that? And I was like, I don't think I could do that right now. Like, I've noticed my character can't look at anything closely. Like, there'd be a dead body and she'd be like, look at the painting over there. Like, she just won't look at things. And so it's been hard. That's had to become kind of the book, is her refusal to get close to things, or because I think as a writer, I'm having trouble staying in scenes. And I don't know if that's the pandemic or just whatever moment my life I'm in, but that's different, because when I wrote the other collection, I could stay in those scenes, in the world and the characters for longer, but this is a lot more of her just kind of going on like mental odysseys. Yeah.
And then there are several more questions in here. I'm not sure how many I'll have time for. So let's see. Oh, Megan asked a question for Sara. How do you think about using metaphors in your work? She says, algae is so beautiful, the idea of it cleaning the air.
Yeah, I was thinking about metaphors in the sense that I don't think about it when I write. I think writing's hard, and I think I have trouble, like I said, writing directly about things. So I'll just search for anything I can write about that day if I'm stuck, something that excites me. And I have a character who likes to think about things that aren't the things that are important. So I think that's how I end up with metaphors, is just wanting to write about this weird stuff that she ends up pouring her emotions into rather than what, she should be.
And then I think I'll wrap. There's 2 questions in the chat, both for Ada and Arinze, and I think they're both kind of asking similar questions, which is, for Ada, you're writing about a 60-year-old woman who is presumably in a different stage of life than you are, and for Arinze, writing with compromise, and then for Arinze with God's children, writing about a university setting, which may be in the past a bit. So what does it mean to kind of pull from these parts of life that you might not presently be in? And do you feel any anxiety writing a part of life that you're not presently living?
Okay, I'll go and then. Yeah. Yeah, I like writing. I like writing about. I like writing about. I like writing from children's very young points of view, and I also like writing from, people who are, older than me, sometimes much older than me, like is the case in Compromise. I don't know. It's not my experience. I've never been 60 years old before, but I have a mother who is about that age, and a father who's about that age. I've had people in my life who are all kinds of ages, and I hear their stories, and I observe how they've made sense of what's happened in their lives, and I don't know. It makes me wonder about them. And in the case of Compromise, my mom told me about this woman in her church and whose husband left, and then he told me many years later that he came back when he was sick, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I just was like, what would that be like? What would that be like, those two people in a room together again? So yeah. Arinze, you're muted.
Oh, sorry.
Still muted.
Oh, okay. Am I back? All right. I was saying that what you say about observation is so interesting and so true. feel for me, Facebook reminded me recently about like an old post I made where I was like, I get all my stories in the kitchen with my aunties and my mom. Like I just like to stay there, like, and just like chat with them. And I feel like that's where you get like that's what I miss about home mostly, because that's, even if you're not taking anything, just say you might not be taking actively, but it's just like, you just get a feel for life. You get a feel for like different experiences that are not yours. But I did write God's Children when I was also like a college student, and so like it was also something that's, it was writing while you're going through it all. But then I also write I write characters who are older than me, who are women, who are like different from me, and for me, how I approach these characters, like knowing that we're all human, and there are certain things about human beings that are just like immutable. And those are like usually the most important things like love and desire and and fear and like all these things are part of humanity, and those things I mean, it doesn't mean that I then would go with some kind of arrogance to write about an experience that is not mine, but that is something to keep at the back of my mind, that then allows me to do the work. So yes, it says a certain kind of empathy allows me to get into the minds of characters that are not like me. But I also recently I have become more aware of the place of age in sort of making us know humans more. I had a story in the collection that I had written a long time ago, and what was working was not structural. It was about, the story is about like this girl who goes back home after the death of her father, who her father had divorced her mom for a lover, and then she's having like an encounter with the father's lover, and I just could not get it right years ago. But what I needed was perspective of age and experience, and so for me, that also like comes into play when writing characters that are not like me.
Thank you all so much. There are several more questions in chat, but I don't want to take up too much of anyone's time. I know someone had asked for book recommendations, so I will just very quickly throw in the chat. Christina, a Public Spaces marketing director, and I got to create a quiz together about what short story you should read next. They've all been published in a Public Space magazine. Arinze's and Ada's are in there, as well as a short story from Jamel Brinkley and Martha Cooley. So I highly recommend, if you haven't taken the quiz yet, to go ahead and take it and then read whichever story you get and take it until you get every single story, because they're all so amazing and incredible. Thank you all so much for reading this evening and for joining us. Congratulations on the books you've written, the stories you've written, and the books that are coming. I know that I can't wait to share them with the world and with everyone here in Chicago. So thank you so much. And a special thank you to A Public Space, as I mentioned, Christina, and to Megan, our moderator. And thank you all for being with us tonight. I hope everyone has an incredible evening. Bye.
Thank you.